Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode we are going to be talking about college football sack rates if they can predict NFL success. This is a topic, it was a recent article that I read, which we're going to get to that article in this video, kind of discussing the Denver Broncos situation. Sean Payton, Russell Wilson got beef, certified beef. Not as bad as Drake and Kendrick Lamar, of course, but they got some problems. And one of the biggest things that was outlined in there was how many sacks Russell Wilson takes, because he does take a lot of sacks as a quarterback. And I wanted to do a deep dive because this is a topic that was brought up during this season with other quarterbacks such as Caleb Williams, and some other players that people kind of they brought it up about Caleb Williams, but they didn't bring it up about guys like Drake May and Jaden Daniels. But they also had some sack rate question marks from college. So we're going to get into everything in this video. So stay tuned into the end of the video where we kind of get an idea if college football sack rates are predictive of NFL success. Are they correlative, if you will, is the best way to put it. And we're going to get right into this video. So first off, a couple things. Starting with the article, of course. This is a article that was released. Sacks are a reason why Nick's not Wilson is Sean Payton's quarterback. So this article was by Mike Kliss. It was released on May 5th. So, as the article states, it says one statistic points out why Sean Payton disliked having Russell Wilson as his quarterback and why the head coach is excited about having Bo Nix. Sacks. Payton does not suffer quarterbacks who take a lot of sacks. The intolerance was revealed in multiple statements he made in recent weeks. All the NFL owners' meetings in late March, Payton was asked to identify areas his offense must address in order to score more points. And the biggest thing that he said was number one, we can't take as many sacks. So Sean Payton doesn't like sacks. Okay. Payton said from the breakfast table in Orlando, if you looked at any of the data relative to what it does for your drives, I think that was a big thing that hurt us a year ago. Wilson took 45 sacks for Payton in 15 games last year. That's 3 per game. That's a lot of sacks. The Broncos ranked 19th in the NFL with 21 points per game. It was statistically the worst offensive production in Payton's 16-season head coaching career. Nix, meanwhile, was sacked just 10 times combined the past 2 years at Oregon, but there's going to be some more information that comes out about that, okay, in terms of the offense that he ran. But yes, pass rushers get quicker in the NFL. Nix will get sacked more than 5 times. So, the crux of the article is simply this. Sean Payton believes that college football sacks indicate whether or not you're going to take a lot of sacks at the NFL level. And he doesn't like sacks for what it can do to his offense. So we got a couple different questions we're going to answer today in this video. One is, do college football sacks predict NFL success? 2, do sacks at the NFL level inherently lead to less winning games? And of course, do sacks inherently hurt the offense as a whole when your sack rates are high? So I know it may be obvious to everybody to kind of have an opinion about this topic, but I really wanted to get into the numbers and really get a definite answer on this as best as possible, of course. And taking a look at the data, so I looked at correlation coefficient data at quarterback, and sacks. The sack rate was not indicative of NFL performance. So you can't just look at the sack rate by itself at the college level and expect a correlation. So what these are correlation coefficients, okay? What they are is they look at the correlation coefficients at the mobile quarterback score, BQS, which is the best quarterback score, career quarterback score, CQS, MEAV, of course, is the mobile quarterback expected approximate value score. That's like the data score for quarterbacks that have mobile ability. The PEAV is the passing uh, ability, basically pocket passer EAV score. DR is draft status adjusted MEAV, and then DRP is pocket passer draft status adjusted. So essentially, draft status plus MEAV and PEAV increases the correlations at the position. And this is from data from 2010 to now. So the reason why I did that is because the sack rate data I have at the college football level only goes back to about 2009. And because of that, I kind of had to limit my sample. So instead of going all the way back to like the 1950s, I was only able to go back to the 2010s. This isn't a bad thing though, because that means that this information is relatively new. It kind of shows you what the trends are currently right now. But the bottom line is when you look at sack rate, if you're just basing whether or not this quarterback is going to have NFL success on the sack rate, there's no correlation between becoming a long-term starter in the NFL and sack rate. But that's not the question that we're asking today. The question that we're asking today really comes down to a different topic entirely, which is what we already stated before, if college football sack rates correlate to the NFL rate, okay? And the data suggests yes. So when I looked at the college football sack rate for quarterbacks that were drafted in the time span between 2010 until 2023, I found that there was a correlation between college football sack rate and NFL sack rate. The correlation was 0.3417 was a correlation coefficient, which means that there is a correlation. It's not a super strong correlation though, and I think there's a lot of factors to that. I think one factor you have to kind of consider is that when it comes to NFL players, or college football players, I should say, there's different things that are kind of out of their control. You know, the offensive line that they have in college, they could have a bad offensive line. The sacks don't necessarily have to be because of their behaviors as a quarterback. So there's a lot of different factors. The scheme can also make quarterbacks less sackable, which is another thing, which we're going to get to when we actually look at the list of quarterbacks. But the scheme can definitely affect things. So you could be in a very high tempo, fast offense that doesn't allow you to take a lot of sacks. You're inherently going to have a lower sack rate because the ball's already out of your hands before a player even gets to you to sack you. So that's one thing to kind of consider and think about as well. And because of that, it's not a super strong correlation, but it does show that it does correlate. So statistically speaking, if a quarterback has a high sack rate in college, there is a chance that they might have a high sack rate in the NFL. Again, it's not a super strong correlation, but it is a correlation nevertheless. So it's an event that could happen. Is legitimately something that you could definitely look at and kind of make some indications on there for that. Next topic comes down to sack rates in the NFL. So what I did with this is I looked at, okay, Sean Payton mentioned in the article that when you take a lot of sacks, it hurts your offense. I looked at three different things in terms of the sack percentage at the NFL level versus various NFL statistics. I went from 2010 until 2023 for this particular data set to kind of look to see, okay, if you have, based on your sack rate, is there a correlation between having a really low sack rate and different things? One is winning football games. So when I looked at winning games, and winning games is just is what it is. It's your win percentage. It was percentile graded from 0, meaning you lost every single game, which there was a couple teams that were like that, to going not 16-0. I don't think we've had a team like that since the 2007 Patriots, but until you have a very high win rate, 15-1, 14-2, that kind of thing. And based on that information, sack percentages did not have it did have a correlation. So if you have a team that has low sack numbers, you typically are going to win more football games. You're not inherently going to win a significantly more football games just because you have a better sack percentage on your offense, but you are correlated to win more football games when your sack rate is low. By the same token, this is stuff that kind of speaks to Sean Payton, which is adjusted net yards per attempt on offense versus the sack rate. This statistic is formulated from Pro Football Reference, and this statistic deals with your adjusted net yards minus your sack yards. So it kind of looks at, okay, how many yards did you actually gain taking out your sacks, if you will. And what it found is if you take less sacks as an offense, you are going to have a 0.4895 correlation in terms of your net yards on offense. So essentially, you're going to have more net yards on offense when you have a lower sack rate. And on top of that, another statistic that I really like from Pro Football Reference is expected points on offense. So this is essentially when the offense is on the football field, what is your expected points to be put onto the board? And what it found was that the lower the sack rate is on your offense, you have a much higher correlation to doing really well in terms of that particular metric. Now, what does this all mean? So just to break it down for you guys to understand as best as possible. I think some of you guys probably already got it. But what this means is that when you have an offense that has a lower sack rate, you are statistically speaking going to have a higher correlation to winning football games. You're going to have a higher correlation to having more net yards per attempt on offense, the passing offense specifically. And you're also going to have a much higher expected points on offense when you have a much lower sack rate. So that would mean it's important. And what we already found out, if you guys are paying attention, is that there is a correlation between a quarterback's sack rate in college and their sack rate at the NFL. So with this information, just to close this video out a little bit, we're going to look at all those quarterbacks. So we're going to look back at the 2024 NFL Draft quarterback class to see how the quarterbacks tested based on the metrics that I just mentioned. This, of course, is just a quick little look at NFL AV for 95 percentile NFL producers in terms of the sack rate. So it can kind of give you a visualization in terms of the sack rate and NFL performance in terms of that. So the sack rate on here is the college football sack rate, not the NFL sack rate, just so you guys don't mismatch that up. But in terms of 90 to 99 percentile sack rates in this particular draft class, the quarterback who had a really high, or I should say not really high, but a really high sack score. So these are like the least sacked quarterbacks in this particular draft class in terms of their sack rate. The number one guy in this class is Michael Penix Jr. Now, when you look at the list of names here, there's some really good names on here. C.J. Stroud, of course, is the very top of the list in terms of his data. Sam Bradford, Deshaun Watson, Tua from Alabama, Andrew Luck, Andy Dalton. But you also have a lot of other quarterbacks in here like Ryan Finley, Bailey Zapp, Landry Jones, Nate Sudfeld, Brandon Allen, Zach Robinson, Ryan Lindley. And the thing that I can really tell you guys is this, is that a lot of the quarterbacks who typically come from offenses like this are they have low sack rates, not necessarily because of their ability as much as the offense that they're in. So when quarterbacks are like this, you have to ask that question because Deshaun Watson, so far in his NFL career, his sack rate has been a little. in terms of other quarterbacks on here as well. So you can kind of go back to the other list that I just showed earlier in the video. But the bottom line is Michael Penix Jr. is with a really high group in terms of his sack rate. But as you can see, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be a winner just because he has a really high or least amount of sack data roll, if you will. Then, of course, we get to the 80 to 89 percentile range. This is where Bo Nix actually showed up. And the reason why is because Bo Nix at Oregon, in Oregon's offense, he had a very low sack rate. But his career, because again, Bo Nix played 5 seasons in college football, was not as high. So when you adjust for his career sack rate, Bo Nix is more so in the 82 percentile. And because of that, that puts him with this group of players. Guys like Derek Carr, guys like Colin Kaepernick, Connor Cook, Trevor Lawrence, those types of prospects. And you have to ask the question, did Bo Nix not take a lot of sacks because of his ability to avoid sacks? Or did he not take a lot of sacks because of the scheme that he was in? Those are questions that you have to ask. Okay. Film can answer some of these questions, but that's the biggest thing that I take away from the top two guys, Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix, is the scheme. The scheme might have had some role in that. So you kind of have to think about that stuff in terms of evaluating them. But again, this is Bo Nix's data right here. Then of course we get to the 80, well no, the 70 to 79.99 percentile range of sacks. This is where we get the J.J. McCarthy's and the Joe Milton the thirds. McCarthy is in a Kyler Murray, Jared Goff, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Rosen kind of area, Kirk Cousins, Nick Foles, those types of players. Again, the sack rate is not correlative. So it doesn't mean that he's going to exactly be like these players, but he did test similar to these players relative to his draft status and his other data combined. So on top of the sack rate. So this is kind of how J.J. McCarthy grades out in terms of this. So there is some success potential here. There also is some question marks here when you look at his data here. Then, of course, we get down to 40 to 49.99. The reason why I did 40 to 49.99 because once you leave the 70 percentile range, there is no 50 or 60 percentile quarterbacks in this particular draft class in terms of sack rate. So we have to go down to the next tier, which is this tier, which is the Caleb Williams tier. And based on his sack rate, he was a 42.24. So sack rate actually wasn't that bad. I mean, it's below average, but it's not. Everybody was making his sack rate out to be like this crazy, ridiculous number that he couldn't recover from in terms of his career. But for the most part, his sack rate has actually not been that bad. You know, it's obviously not great, but it's not bad. And he's in line with guys like Baker Mayfield, Jalen Hurts, Deshaun Kaiser is kind of on the lower end of things. But again, sack rates aren't correlative in terms of actual NFL success, but they do indicate that you might have a similar sack rate at the NFL level. Okay. And I do know some people have watched Caleb Williams' film and have concluded that the sacks were all his fault, or at the very least, he was trying to play hero ball and all that. All the criticisms. I don't want to go through all the criticisms all over again, but this is how Caleb Williams tested. Jordan Travis, Cardell Jones. Actually, not Cardell Jones. That's a different different draft class. Devin Leary, Kentucky. Those are also some of the players with similar sack results. Then, of course, we get to the 30 to 39.99 area. And this is where things get a little juicy, guys, because this is where we get into the mobile quarterback era, or area, I should say. Because a lot of the quarterbacks that have this sack rate, you know, Cam Newton, for example, Russell Wilson, those types of players are Josh Allen. Those are players who have sack rates partially because of their running ability. So these are players that are trying to extend the play with their legs, and as a result, they're probably going to take more sacks. Also, it's a trend where if a quarterback is behind the line of scrimmage and he runs out of bounds, that's also considered a sack. So that's another thing to kind of consider when it comes to this list. But though, a couple players in here that kind of are a little sketchy is Drake May. Drake May is in this list of prospects, which is a little scary to me because I don't really view Drake May as a Cam Newton or as a Russell Wilson. You might be able to put him in as a Joe Burrow. I know Joe Burrow has had his issues at Cincinnati in terms of taking sacks, but I don't really know. Drake May is definitely a little bit of a concern because of being in this area. Jaden Daniels as well. I think he kind of is right in line with other mobile quarterbacks in terms of his sack rate with guys like Russell Wilson, Josh Allen, Cam Newton, those types of players. So I don't really not really worry too much about Jaden Daniels. He also improved his sack rate in his final season at LSU. So he went from below average to about a 66 percentile. But again, this is what their average sack rate was in college. So Jaden Daniels also is in this group, and then of course you have Spencer Rattler, who is with the Alex Mugu, T.J. Yates kind of area of things when you look at his sack rate, which is again a little bit of a concern. E.J. Manuel as well. So that's essentially how this group stacks up in terms of 30 to 39 percentile. The final group we're going to look at is the 0 to 29.99 sack rate group, which is only one quarterback, and it's Michael Pratt. And it puts them in such a low sack rate that it's kind of concerning. It's a little concerning here because you look at this and you go, dang, that is a really low. He took a lot of sacks at Tulane. He really did. And then of course you have Lamar Jackson's in here, and he's another player that kind of improved his sack rate at the NFL level. Justin Fields, of course, didn't improve his sack rate that much um, from last year. But again, this is kind of what's expected from this list. So only real player to really talk about is Michael Pratt, but overall the quarterback sack rate for this list is 0 to 29.99. In conclusion, in terms of my final thoughts on this, and I wanted to make this video to kind of do something a little bit different. Based on what Sean Payton said, I think there is a little bit of nugget of wisdom there, which comes down to this. Sack rate does have an impact on winning NFL games. Sack rate does have an impact in terms of the overall offense. And there is a slight correlation to what a college player's sack rate is in college and what their sack rate could be at the NFL level. However, it is not a super strong correlation either. And you will have prospects who come from offenses that have low sack rates, when in reality it has nothing to do with the quarterback as much as the scheme. And because of that, that is the one thing that kind of bothers me a little bit about the narrative here. Is just because Bo Nix came from a offensive system at Oregon where he only took a handful of sacks every year there, that doesn't mean that he is just like a Peyton Manning or a Drew Brees level ability to avoid sacks. And by the same token, just because your offense is good at preventing sacks, which I could say Sean Payton's offenses were definitely like that. They also didn't necessarily win a lot of football games either at a very high rate, and that's because you also have to take into account the overall team ability in terms of the defensive side of the football and everything else with that. So you could have a high powered offense that doesn't take a lot of sacks, but you're also not giving your defense a chance to breathe and do what it needs to do as well from that perspective. But this was a quarterback class based on sack rate. I hope this answered the questions that I really wanted to answer in this particular video in terms of the correlation coefficients and everything else like that. I think sack rates at the college level is a stat that I might bring up every now and again. Again, the correlations are much better in terms of the passing efficiency ability and the mobile quarterback ability. those types of things. So yes, sack rates are something to pay attention to, but I don't think they're at the rate that you should just drop everything and just base your whole board based on their sack rates in college. So because of that, I think it's a stat that is more descriptive than predictive. It can tell you some things about a prospect. I think if they score really low in it, like this area right here, that could tell you some red flags in terms of them as a prospect. But at the same time, if they're not in that bottom end area, then I don't really think sack rates really should be paid attention to as much as a lot of people seem to want to pay attention to them. So with that stuff out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Jim Coburn. You can check out my other work at patreon.com/jcoburn. Also check out my X, formerly known as Twitter account at Geometrics. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.